The blood-red sun dipped below the jagged horizon as Katherine Atwood stood frozen on the porch of her family's modest farmhouse, her trembling fingers clutching the telegram that had shattered her world. Her father was dead, his debts overwhelming, and she now belonged to a man whose reputation made grown men cross the street when they saw him coming. Stillwater, Arizona Territory, 1878, had always been a harsh place to call home, but for 20-year-old Katherine, it had at least been safe. Her father, despite his gambling problem, had protected her from the brutal realities of frontier life. Now, with his body barely cold in the ground, his creditors had come calling chief among them, Victor Blackstone, the most feared man in 3 counties. "You have until Sunday to pack your things," Blackstone had told her earlier that day, his voice as cold as the silver handle of the revolver that never left his side. "The preacher's been paid. You'll be Mrs. Blackstone before sundown, or I'll take this house and everything in it anyway." Katherine's fingers traced the lace collar of her mother's dress, the only thing she had left of the woman who died bringing her into this world. She would not cry. Crying never solved anything in Stillwater. "Miss Atwood," a deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Katherine whirled around, her hand instinctively reaching for her father's old rifle propped by the door. The silhouette of a man stood at the edge of her property, his features obscured by the dying light. "State your business or be on your way," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The man stepped forward, and Katherine's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him immediately: Quentin Pierce, the quiet cowboy who delivered mail to their farm for the past few months. His hat was pulled low, but she could still make out his strong jawline and those eyes that seemed to hold more stories than the dog-eared books on her shelf. "I heard about your father," he said, removing his hat, "and about Blackstone's arrangement." Katherine's shoulders stiffened. "News travels fast in Stillwater. Too fast sometimes." He took another step forward. "I also heard you don't have much choice in the matter." "I don't see how that's any of your concern, Mr. Pierce." Her voice was sharper than she'd intended, but pride was all she had left. Quentin nodded slowly. "Maybe not. But I've seen what happens to folks who get tangled up with Victor Blackstone. They don't tend to live happy lives. If they live at all." The weight of his words settled over her like a shroud. Everyone knew Blackstone's first 2 wives had met untimely ends, the first in a tragic accident on the stairs, the second from a fever that conveniently struck after she'd been seen talking too long with a young ranch hand. "I appreciate your concern," Katherine said, her voice softening, "but unless you've come with a miracle in your saddlebag, I don't see what can be done." Quentin stepped fully into the yard now, and in the fading light, Katherine could see something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before: determination, mixed with something that looked strangely like hope. "What if I told you I might have something better than a miracle?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Katherine's heart beat faster. "I'd say you're either a fool or the answer to a prayer I was too scared to speak aloud." A small smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Maybe I'm both." He glanced around nervously. "We shouldn't talk out in the open." "Blackstone has eyes everywhere." Katherine hesitated only a moment before gesturing toward the door. "Come inside, then. I've got nothing left to lose but time." As Quentin Pierce crossed her threshold, Katherine couldn't help but feel that something significant had just changed in her life. Whether it was for better or worse, only time would tell. Inside the modest farmhouse, the lamp's glow cast long shadows across the worn furniture. Katherine motioned for Quentin to sit at the small kitchen table while she poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that had been simmering all day. "Whatever you're thinking, Mr. Pierce, you should know that Victor Blackstone isn't a man who gives up what he considers his," she said, setting a steaming cup before him. Quentin wrapped his calloused hands around the mug but didn't drink. "I've been riding for the Diamond Bar Ranch these past 2 years, keeping my head down, watching what happens in this town." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Blackstone isn't just a killer, Miss Atwood. He's a man who believes he owns this valley and everyone in it. And yet you're sitting in my kitchen, talking about defying him. Katherine studied him carefully. Why would you risk your life for a woman you barely know? A muscle worked in Quentin's jaw. Because I've been running from men like him my whole life. Because every time I turned away when someone needed help, a piece of me died with them. He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands. And because the moment I delivered that first letter to you last spring, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman with amber eyes who thanked me like I'd brought her the world, instead of just a letter from her cousin in Tucson. Katherine felt heat rising in her cheeks. She remembered that day the letter from her cousin had been the first contact she'd had with family in over a year. She'd been so grateful she'd impulsively squeezed the mailman's hand, not realizing then how blue his eyes were or how that brief touch had lingered in her memory. That's hardly reason enough to put yourself in Blackstone's crosshairs, she whispered. Maybe not. Quentin finally took a sip of his coffee. But I've also seen what he does to people. Your father wasn't the first man to mysteriously lose everything to Blackstone's lucky streak at cards. Katherine's eyes widened. Are you saying my father was cheated? I'm saying Blackstone doesn't leave things to chance when he wants something. Quentin leaned forward. And for some reason he wants you and this land badly enough to force a wedding. Katherine's mind raced. Her father's property wasn't particularly valuable, just a small farm with decent water access, certainly nothing worth killing for. There must be something more, she murmured, more to herself than to Quentin. There is. Quentin's voice dropped even lower. Word is, the railroad's planning a new spur line through the territory. The surveyors have been quiet about it, but I delivered mail to them last month. Their maps had a station marked right where your north pasture meets Blackstone's property. Katherine's breath caught. A railroad station would transform worthless scrubland into a fortune overnight, so that's why he's so determined. And why we need to act fast. Quentin's eyes were grave. The wedding's in 2 days. Once you're his wife, everything you own becomes his property by law. What can we possibly do in 2 days? The hopelessness she'd been fighting threatened to overwhelm her. Quentin reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of hers. We leave, tonight. Katherine stared at him in disbelief. Just run away to Tucson first. I have a friend at the territorial courthouse there. With evidence of Blackstone's crimes, we might be able to get the marshal's office involved. His expression was earnest. It's risky, and I can't promise it will work, but it's better than surrendering your life to a man who'll dispose of you once he has what he wants. Katherine stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. You're asking me to abandon my home. Everything my father worked for, I'm asking you to choose life over a death sentence, Quentin interrupted, rising to his feet. Your father wouldn't want you sacrificing yourself for property, no matter how much blood and sweat he put into it. The truth of his words struck Katherine like a physical blow. Her father had been flawed, too fond of whiskey and cards, but he'd loved her fiercely. He would never have wanted this fate for her. If we leave, Blackstone will know exactly who helped me, she said quietly. He'll hunt us both. A grim smile touched Quentin's lips. Let him try. I wasn't always just a mailman and cowhand, Miss Atwood. Something in his tone made Katherine look at him with new eyes. The way he carried himself, the weathered look that spoke of more than just sun exposure, there was history there, perhaps as dark as the night falling around them. Who were you before Stillwater? Quentin Pierce. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed deeply. I rode with the Texas Rangers for 3 years. Before that, I tracked Confederate deserters during the war. I've faced worse men than Victor Blackstone. Katherine's heart pounded in her chest. Hope, dangerous, fragile hope, began to bloom. If I go with you tonight, what happens afterward? Where would I go? That would be your choice entirely. His eyes held her steadily. I'd see you safe, help you clear your father's name if possible, and then, whatever you wanted, you'd be free. Freedom. The word hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying all at once. "I need a moment," Katherine whispered, turning toward the small bedroom where she'd grown from child to woman. Inside, she pressed her hand against the faded quilt her mother had sewn before her birth. Everything she'd ever known was in this house, and yet. Katherine returned to the kitchen with new resolve in her eyes. "How soon can we leave?" Relief flooded Quentin's face. "As soon as you can pack a single bag with essentials. We'll need to travel light and fast." Katherine nodded, already mentally cataloging what she couldn't bear to leave behind. "Give me 15 minutes." As she turned to go, Quentin caught her wrist gently. "Katherine." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I promise I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe." For a moment, they stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the leather and pine scent that clung to him. Then, with a nod, she pulled away and hurried to prepare for a journey into the unknown. True to her word, Katherine was ready in 15 minutes, a small carpet bag containing a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a photograph of her parents, and what little money she had saved. She'd changed into a sturdy riding skirt and blouse, her hair braided tightly down her back. Quentin had used the time to saddle his horse and bring it around to the back of the house. "We'll need to share the mount until we can get far enough away to risk buying you a horse," he explained, helping her secure her bag to the saddle. "Palomino here is strong enough for both of us for a while." Katherine hesitated only briefly, before allowing Quentin to lift her onto the horse. As she settled into the saddle, he swung up behind her with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. "We'll head southeast through the canyon," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear as he reached around her for the reins. "It's harder to track there, and we can reach the old missionary road by dawn if we push hard." Katherine nodded, acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arms on either side of her creating a protective circle. She'd never been this close to a man before, and despite the fear and uncertainty clouding her mind, she couldn't help noticing how safe it felt. They set off at a steady pace, keeping to the shadows whenever possible. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, offering little light but also little chance of being spotted. Katherine tried not to think about what she was leaving behind or what dangers might lie ahead. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of the horse beneath them and the solid presence of the man at her back. They rode in silence for the first hour, both too tense to speak. It was only when they paused at a small stream to let the horse drink that Katherine voiced the question that had been nagging at her. "How did you know? About my father's debts, about Blackstone's plans for me?" She turned to face Quentin in the darkness. He knelt by the stream, filling their canteen before answering. "I deliver mail, remember? I see a lot of things, telegrams, bank notices, legal papers." He straightened up. "And I hear even more. People don't notice a mailman, they talk freely around us. That doesn't explain why you care." She studied his face in the dim light. "Most people in town would say I'm getting what I deserve for being Henry Atwood's daughter." Quentin's expression hardened. "Most people in town are cowards who'd rather watch an innocent woman suffer than stand against a man like Blackstone." "And you're not a coward." She hadn't meant it as a challenge, but it came out that way. "I've been a coward plenty of times in my life," he admitted, capping the canteen, "but not this time, not with you." The simple honesty in his voice left no room for doubt. They continued riding through the night, the landscape gradually changing from flat farmland to rocky terrain. Katherine found herself drifting in and out of an uneasy doze, her head occasionally nodding back against Quentin's shoulder. Each time, she'd jerk awake, embarrassed, but he never commented, just adjusted his hold to keep her secure. Dawn was breaking when disaster struck. They were picking their way along a narrow trail when a rattlesnake spooked Palomino. The horse reared suddenly, and Katherine, half asleep, wasn't prepared. She slipped sideways, Quentin's desperate grab missing her by inches as she tumbled down the rocky slope. Pain exploded in her ankle as she landed awkwardly, rocks scraping her palms and arms. She bit back a cry, knowing that any sound might carry in the still morning air. Quentin was off the horse and at her side in seconds, his face tight with concern. "Katherine, are you hurt?" She tried to stand but collapsed back with a gasp when she put weight on her right foot. "My ankle, I think it's sprained." Quentin's hands were gentle as he examined her injury, his fingers probing carefully through her boot. "It's swelling already. We need to bind it and get you somewhere safe to rest." His eyes scanned the terrain. "We're not far from Jackson's Creek. There's an abandoned line shack there where we can hide out for a day." "We don't have time," Katherine protested. "Blackstone will discover I'm gone by midday. He'll send men after us." "We don't have a choice," Quentin said firmly. "You can't ride like this, and we're still hours from the missionary road." He helped her to a seated position. "I'm going to make a compress with cold water, then bind your ankle. It'll hurt, but it needs to be done." As he worked, Katherine watched his face, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the gentleness of his hands despite their obvious strength. This man who barely knew her was risking everything to save her from a fate worse than death. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked suddenly. "All those times you delivered mail, you never let on that you noticed me." Quentin's hands paused briefly before continuing to wrap a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt around her ankle. "What was I supposed to say?" "Good morning, Miss Atwood. Here's your mail, and by the way, I think you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." A faint smile touched his lips. "I'm just a cowboy who delivers mail on the side. Your father would have run me off with a shotgun." Katherine's heart stuttered at his words. "You think I'm beautiful?" His eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. "I think you're a lot more than that. I think you're brave and kind and stronger than you know." For a moment, they just looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Then Quentin cleared his throat and finished binding her ankle. "That should hold until we reach the shack," he said, his voice gruff. "I'll need to carry you to the horse." Before she could protest, he'd scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Katherine wrapped her arms around his neck, suddenly very aware of his closeness, the steady beat of his heart against her side. "Thank you," she whispered as he set her carefully on Palomino's back. "Not just for this, but for everything." Quentin's hand lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "We're not safe yet," he reminded her, though his eyes said something different. As he mounted behind her once more, his arms encircling her to take the reins, Katherine realized that despite the danger they were in, despite leaving behind everything she'd ever known, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. And perhaps something else, something warmer that bloomed in her chest whenever Quentin Pierce looked at her with those steady blue eyes. They reached the abandoned line shack just as the sun climbed high in the sky. It was little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a small stove and a single cot against the wall, but to Katherine's weary eyes, it looked like sanctuary. Quentin helped her inside, settling her on the cot before going back to unsaddle Palomino and hide their tracks as best he could. While he was gone, Katherine took the opportunity to examine their temporary refuge. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but otherwise, the shack was in reasonable condition. A stack of firewood sat beside the stove, and a shelf held a few dented tins of food left behind by previous occupants. When Quentin returned, he immediately set about making the place more habitable. He swept the worst of the dust out the door, started a small fire in the stove, and opened a tin of beans he'd found on the shelf. "It's not much," he apologized, offering her a portion on a battered tin plate he'd wiped clean with his bandana. "It's more than I expected," Katherine said truthfully. She hadn't thought about food when they fled, and her stomach growled appreciatively at even this simple meal. As they ate, Quentin outlined his plan. "We'll rest here today and tonight. Your ankle needs time, and it's safer to travel after dark anyway. Tomorrow at first light we'll make for the missionary road, then on to Tucson. My friend there, James Sullivan, is a clerk at the courthouse. He's been gathering evidence against Blackstone for years, but there's never been anyone willing to testify." "And you think I can?" Katherine asked doubtfully. I don't know anything about his illegal activities. You know he forced your father into debt through crooked card games. And you know he tried to coerce you into marriage to get your land." Quentin's expression was grim. That might be enough to get the territorial marshal to take a closer look at his other dealings. Katherine wasn't convinced but nodded anyway. She was too exhausted to argue, the events of the past 24 hours finally catching up with her. Quentin noticed her fatigue. "You should rest," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." "What about you?" she asked. "You haven't slept either." "I'm used to going without sleep." He smiled slightly. "One of the benefits of rangering, you learn to catch a few minutes whenever you can." Katherine wanted to insist he rest too, but her eyelids were already growing heavy. She lay back on the cot, wincing as her injured ankle protested the movement. Just as she was drifting off, she felt something being tucked around her. Quentin's coat, still warm from his body. His scent enveloped her, comforting in its masculine simplicity. She mumbled a thank you, already half asleep. The last thing she remembered before succumbing to exhaustion was the sensation of gentle fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face and a soft voice saying, "Sleep well, Katherine. I won't let anything happen to you." She woke to the sound of male voices outside the shack. Panic surged through her as she bolted upright, ignoring the pain in her ankle. Quentin was at the window, his gun drawn, motioning for her to be silent. "Tracks definitely lead this way," a gruff voice said. "Boss says she couldn't have gotten far on her own, so someone's helping her." "Probably that new hand from the Diamond Bar," another voice replied. Always looking at her when he thought nobody was noticing. "What was his name?" "Pierce. Quentin Pierce. Boss says he wants him alive if possible, says he wants to make an example out of anyone who touches what's his." Katherine's blood ran cold. She looked at Quentin, whose face had hardened into a mask of determination. He glanced at her, then nodded toward the back wall where a loose board served as a makeshift emergency exit. "They're circling around," he whispered, moving to her side. "We need to go. Now." "My ankle, I'll carry you if I have to," he cut her off. "But we have to move." With his help, Katherine limped to the back of the shack. Quentin carefully removed the loose board, creating a space just big enough for them to slip through. Outside, Palomino was tethered in a small stand of trees, out of sight from the front of the shack. "I'm going to create a distraction," Quentin said, checking his revolver. "When you hear shots, make for the horse. I'll be right behind you." "No," Katherine grabbed his arm. "That's exactly what they want to separate us." Quentin hesitated, clearly torn between the need to protect her and the tactical sense of what she was saying. "Together," she insisted, "or not at all." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You are something else, Katherine Atwood." He glanced toward the front of the shack. "All right, together, but stay low and move as fast as you can." He helped her through the opening first, then followed, pulling the board back into place behind them. They crouched in the shadow of the shack, listening intently. The voices were closer now, just on the other side of the thin walls. "On three," Quentin whispered. 1, 2, 3, they moved as one, Quentin supporting Katherine as she hobbled toward the trees. They had almost reached the horse when a shout went up behind them. "There they are." A shot cracked through the air, splintering bark from a tree inches from Katherine's head. Quentin returned fire, pushing her behind him as he aimed calmly at their pursuers. A man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. Quentin lifted Katherine onto Palomino's back in one fluid motion, then swung up behind her. They galloped away as more shots rang out, but none found their mark. The dense trees provided cover as they fled deeper into the canyon. "Are you hit?" Katherine gasped when they finally slowed to give the horse a breather. "No," Quentin replied, his voice tight, "but they'll be after us. They know where we're headed now." "What do we do?" Quentin surveyed the rugged terrain around them. "Change plans. We can't risk the missionary road now." He pointed to a barely visible trail winding up the canyon wall. "We'll take the high pass. It's treacherous, but Blackstone's men might not know it exists. And if they do," his arms tightened around her, "then we'll deal with that when it comes." "But I'm not letting them take you back to him, Katherine. Not while I'm still breathing." The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent a shiver down her spine, not of fear, but of something far more complicated. In the space of a day, this man had become her entire world, the only thing standing between her and a life of misery, or worse. They pushed on, the path growing steeper and narrower. Palomino picked his way carefully over loose rocks and around dangerous drops. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough to see for miles across the territory. In the distance, the speck that was Stillwater shimmered in the heat. "We should reach the summit by nightfall," Quentin said, his breath warm against her ear. "There's a small plateau where we can rest." Katherine nodded, too focused on ignoring the throbbing pain in her ankle to form words. Despite Quentin's gentle handling, hours on horseback had aggravated her injury. She could feel it swelling against the bindings, each jolting step sending fresh waves of agony up her leg. She must have made some small sound of distress because Quentin immediately reined in. "You're in pain." It wasn't a question, but Katherine shook her head anyway. "I'm fine, we can't stop." "We can for a few minutes." His tone brooked no argument. He dismounted and lifted her down, supporting her weight as he helped her to a flat rock. "Let me check that ankle." Katherine submitted to his examination, biting her lip as he unwound the makeshift bandage. The sight of her swollen, discolored ankle made them both wince. "It's worse," she admitted. Quentin nodded grimly. "We need to get you to a doctor." "Not until we're safe from Blackstone," he sighed, rewrapping her ankle with gentle efficiency. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, you know that." Despite everything, Katherine found herself smiling. "My father used to say the same thing, said I got it from my mother." "I wish I could have known her," Quentin said softly. "She must have been extraordinary to have raised a daughter like you." The simple comment brought unexpected tears to Katherine's eyes. No one had ever spoken of her mother that way before. Most people in Stillwater had long forgotten Sarah Atwood, who died so many years ago. "She would have liked you," Katherine whispered, wiping at her eyes. "My father, too, once he got past his suspicions of any man who looked at me twice." Quentin's hand covered hers, warm and reassuring. "I would have welcomed his suspicions if it meant a chance to court you properly." The word court hung between them, fraught with meaning. This was no ordinary situation, no conventional beginning to a romance. They were fugitives, their lives in danger with every passing minute. And yet, here on this mountain path with the world spread out below them, Katherine felt something blooming inside her chest, a wild hope that perhaps this nightmare could lead to something beautiful. "We should keep moving," she said finally, unable to find the words to express the tumult of emotions inside her. Quentin helped her back onto the horse, and they continued their ascent in silence. But something had shifted between them, some unspoken understanding that made Katherine's heart beat faster whenever his arms tightened around her to navigate a particularly treacherous stretch of trail. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they reached the summit plateau Quentin had mentioned. It was a natural fortress, protected on three sides by sheer drops and accessible only by the narrow path they had ascended. "We'll be safe here for the night," Quentin said as he helped Katherine dismount. "No one can approach without us seeing them coming." He set about making camp with practiced efficiency, unsaddling Palomino, gathering what meager firewood could be found at this elevation, and preparing a small, nearly smokeless fire. Katherine wished she could help more, but her ankle limited her to simple tasks like laying out their bedrolls and sorting through their dwindling supplies. As night fell, bringing with it the deep chill of the mountains, they huddled close to the fire. Quentin had shot a jackrabbit on their way up, and the small meal of roasted meat was the most satisfying thing Katherine could remember eating in a long time. "Tell me about yourself," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "You know so much about me, but I know almost nothing about you." Quentin poked at the fire, his expression thoughtful. "Not much to tell. I grew up in East Texas, son of a blacksmith, joined the Army young, then the Rangers after the war, came west when." He hesitated. "When what?" Katherine prompted gently. He sighed, staring into the flames. When I killed a man I shouldn't have. Katherine's breath caught, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. He was a cattle rustler, or so I thought. Turned out he was just a Mexican farmhand who'd gotten separated from his employer's herd during a storm. The self-loathing in Quentin's voice was palpable. I was too quick on the trigger, too sure of myself. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. What happened? Katherine asked softly. The Rangers covered it up, said it was a justified shooting. His hands clenched into fists. But I knew the truth, so I left, came west, tried to become someone who thought before he acted, who protected innocent people instead of harming them. Katherine reached out, covering his fist with her hand. That's who you are now, the man who's risking his life to save me. Quentin turned his hand over, his fingers intertwining with hers. I'm not a hero, Katherine. I've made too many mistakes for that. You're my hero, she said simply. And that's all that matters to me right now. Their eyes met across the flickering firelight, and for a breathless moment, Katherine thought he might lean forward and kiss her. But instead, he squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. You should get some rest, he said, his voice husky. Tomorrow will be another long day. Katherine nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. She settled onto her bedroll, pulling the blanket tight around her against the mountain chill. Quentin, she murmured as sleep began to claim her. Yes, thank you for telling me the truth. She thought she heard him whisper, always, in response. But she was already drifting into dreams where a blue-eyed cowboy carried her away from darkness into light. The morning brought clear skies and a painful reality check. Katherine's ankle had stiffened overnight, making it nearly impossible for her to walk without support. More concerning was the red streaking visible above the swelling signs of infection setting in. Quentin's face was grim as he examined her injury. This isn't good. We need to get you to a doctor sooner rather than later. How far are we from Tucson? Katherine asked, trying to keep the pain out of her voice. 2 days hard ride, even taking the pass. His eyes met hers, worry evident in their blue depths. But there's a mining settlement about half a day from here, Copper Springs. They have a doctor of sorts. Of sorts? He's really a dentist, but he patches up the miners when they get hurt. He might have medicine to fight the infection, at least. Katherine nodded. The throbbing in her ankle had intensified overnight, and she knew enough about wound infections to understand the danger she was in. If the infection reached her bloodstream, no amount of running from Blackstone would matter. Copper Springs it is, she agreed. They broke camp quickly, Quentin wrapping Katherine's ankle with the last of their clean bandages before helping her onto Palomino. The descent from the plateau was even more treacherous than the ascent had been, with loose shale making the trail slippery and unpredictable. Quentin dismounted to lead the horse down the steepest sections, one hand on the reins, the other reaching back to steady Katherine whenever the ground shifted beneath them. By midday, they had descended into a valley dotted with scrub, pine, and juniper. The air was warmer here, heavy with the scent of sage and dust. In the distance, the telltale signs of a mining operation came into view: tailings piles, the skeletal frames of headworks, the scattered shacks and tents of a settlement that had sprung up overnight when copper was discovered. Copper Springs was a rough place, the kind of boom town that appeared and disappeared with the fortunes of the mine. As they approached, Katherine could see men moving about, miners ending their shifts, saloon girls beginning theirs, the constant flow of humanity driven by the search for ore and the pleasures that mining wages could buy. Keep your head down, Quentin advised as they rode into town. Even this far out, Blackstone might have contacts. Katherine nodded, pulling her hat lower to shadow her face. She was acutely aware of the stares they attracted. A woman was still an unusual sight in places like this, especially one riding double with a grim-faced cowboy. They stopped in front of a weathered building with a faded sign proclaiming Dr. F. Wilson, dental surgeon and physician. Quentin helped Katherine down, supporting her weight as they made their way to the door. The interior was dimly lit, and smelled strongly of alcohol and clove oil. A thin man with spectacles and a surprisingly elegant mustache looked up from a desk covered in papers. "Well now, what have we here?" he asked, his accent marking him as an Easterner Boston, perhaps. "My wife took a fall," Quentin said smoothly, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Injured her ankle. It's starting to look infected." Dr. Wilson raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on the obvious tension between his new patients or the fact that neither wore a wedding ring. He simply gestured toward an examination table covered with a stained sheet. "Let's have a look, shall we?" His gentle hands belied his rough appearance as he unwrapped Catherine's ankle. He clucked his tongue at what he saw. Nasty sprain indeed, and yes, there's infection setting in. He glanced up at Catherine's pale face. "This is going to hurt, my dear." Katherine nodded, bracing herself. Quentin moved to her side, offering his hand. She took it gratefully, squeezing hard as Dr. Wilson cleaned the wound with a solution that burned like fire. "I'm going to apply a poultice to draw out the infection," the doctor explained as he worked. "And I'll give you some powders to take with water. But what this ankle really needs is rest at least a week off your feet." Quentin and Katherine exchanged worried glances. They didn't have a week. They might not even have a day if Blackstone's men had picked up their trail again. "Is there somewhere in town we could stay?" Quentin asked. "Somewhere, discreet." The doctor's shrewd eyes assessed them both. "Running from something, are you?" Katherine tensed, but Quentin's expression remained neutral, just looking for privacy. Dr. Wilson sighed. "Mrs. Holloway takes in boarders on the edge of town. She's a widow, keeps to herself, doesn't ask questions. Tell her Frederick sent you." "Thank you, doctor," Katherine said as he finished bandaging her ankle. "What do we owe you?" $2 for the treatment, another $1 for the powders." He named a sum that was reasonable by frontier standards. Quentin paid without haggling, adding an extra $half that made the doctor's eyebrows rise again. "For your discretion," Quentin said quietly. Dr. Wilson pocketed the money with a nod. "Word of advice. Whatever you're running from, this town isn't the place to hide for long. Too many men with loose tongues and easy morals." "We'll keep that in mind," Quentin assured him. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. Quentin helped Katherine back onto Palomino, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. "You doing all right?" he asked, his voice low with concern. Katherine managed a weak smile. "I've been better, but I'm still here thanks to you." The ride to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house took only a few minutes. The widow turned out to be a tiny woman with iron gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. When Quentin mentioned Dr. Wilson's name, her expression softened marginally. "Got one room left," she said after looking them over. "With a single bed." "That going to be a problem?" Before Katherine could respond, Quentin answered smoothly. "No problem at all. My wife and I are grateful for whatever accommodations you can provide." The lie about their relationship was necessary. Katherine knew. But something about hearing Quentin call her his wife sent a flutter through her stomach that had nothing to do with her injury. Mrs. Holloway showed them to a small but clean room at the back of the house. "Supper's at 6, she informed them. "Bathhouse is out back if you've a mind to wash up. Extra charge for hot water." When she'd gone, Katherine sank onto the bed with a groan of relief. "I don't think I could have stayed on that horse another minute." Quentin set down their meager belongings and knelt before her, gently removing her boots. "You should rest. I'll see about getting us some supplies and finding out if there's been any word about Blackstone's men in the area." "Be careful," Katherine urged, suddenly afraid to let him out of her sight. "If they've followed us this far, I'll be back before you know it," he promised, his hand squeezing hers reassuringly. "Take the powders the doctor gave you and try to sleep." After he'd gone, Katherine did as instructed, washing down the bitter medicine with water from the pitcher beside the bed. Despite her anxiety about Quentin venturing out alone, exhaustion soon pulled her into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to the sound of the door opening. Twilight had fallen, the room now shrouded in shadows. For a moment, disoriented from sleep and medication, Katherine didn't recognize the figure entering the room. "Quentin," she called uncertainly. "It's me," he confirmed, striking a match to light the lamp beside the bed. In its glow, she could see he carried a bundle under one arm and wore a troubled expression. "How are you feeling?" "Better, I think." She pushed herself up to sitting, testing her ankle cautiously. The pain had subsided to a dull ache. "What's wrong? You look worried." Quentin set the bundle down new supplies, she presumed, and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "I made some inquiries around town. There's talk of men asking questions about a young woman and a cowboy passing through." Katherine's heart sank. "Blackstone's men are here." "Not yet. But they've been to settlements north of here, working their way down. They'll reach Copper Springs by tomorrow, most likely." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was coming to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "We need to move on tonight." "Tonight." Katherine looked down at her ankle. The swelling had decreased somewhat, but she knew she still couldn't walk far unaided. "Can we risk it?" "We can't risk staying," Quentin countered, "but I have a plan." He explained that he'd purchased supplies enough for several days' journey and had learned of an alternate route to Tucson, longer but less traveled, following an old Apache trail through the mountains. "The man who told me about it swears even experienced trackers would have trouble following us," Quentin said. "But it means rough terrain and at least 3 days of travel." Katherine considered their options. Staying meant certain capture once Blackstone's men arrived. The main road to Tucson would be watched. The mountain trail, dangerous as it might be, offered their best chance. "When do we leave?" she asked simply. Relief flickered across Quentin's features. "After supper. Mrs. Holloway says there's no moon tonight, good cover for slipping away." Katherine nodded, trying to ignore the twinge of fear at the thought of navigating mountain paths in darkness. "We'll need to be careful with my ankle. I don't want to slow us down." Quentin's expression softened as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, Katherine Atwood. We'll make it together." His touch left a trail of warmth on her skin, and Katherine found herself leaning slightly into his hand. For a brief moment, the world outside Blackstone, the danger, the uncertain future all faded away. There was only this room, this man, and the connection growing between them with each passing hour. "Quentin," she whispered, his name a question and an invitation all at once. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, his lips found hers in a kiss so gentle it made her heart ache. His hand cupped her cheek, thumb stroking softly along her jawline as the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more needful. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the first time I saw you," he admitted. Katherine smiled, her hands still resting on his shoulders. "What took you so long?" His answering laugh was soft and warm. "I was waiting for the right moment. Though I have to say, being chased by killers wasn't exactly what I had in mind." "Life rarely goes according to plan," she murmured, thinking of how drastically her own life had changed in just a few short days. Quentin's expression grew serious again. "When this is over, when you're safe, I want a chance to court you properly. No danger, no running, just a man asking a woman he admires deeply if she might someday consider him worthy of her affection." The formal, almost old-fashioned declaration brought tears to Katherine's eyes. In a world where women were too often treated as property to be claimed, Quentin was offering her a choice, the freedom to decide her own heart. "I think I'd like that very much," she whispered. The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Holloway's sharp knock announcing supper. But as they made their way to the dining room, Quentin's hand supporting Katherine as she limped along, something had shifted between them. Whatever lay ahead, danger, hardship, uncertainty, they would face it together. No longer just allies in escape, but two people discovering something precious amid the chaos. Supper was a quiet affair, with Mrs. Holloway serving a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and cornbread. The widow asked no questions about their plans. though Katherine caught her watching them with knowing eyes when she thought they weren't looking. After the meal, they returned to their room to prepare for their midnight departure. Quentin helped Katherine change the bandage on her ankle, his touch clinical but gentle. The infection seemed to be responding to the doctor's treatment. The angry red streaks had faded, and the swelling continued to decrease. "Try to get some rest before we leave," Quentin advised. "I'll wake you when it's time." Katherine nodded, settling back on the bed while Quentin took a seat in the room's single chair, his gun across his lap as he maintained his vigilant watch. Despite her intention to stay awake, the combination of medicine and exhaustion soon pulled her into sleep. She dreamed of Stillwater, of her father alive and well, embracing her on the porch of their farmhouse. But when she pulled back to look at him, his face had changed to Victor Blackstone's, his grip turning painful as he dragged her toward a waiting preacher. "You belong to me now," Dream Blackstone snarled, "always and forever." Katherine jerked awake with a gasp, her heart pounding. The room was dark except for a sliver of moonlight through the curtains. Quentin was instantly at her side, his hand warm on her shoulder. "Just a nightmare," he soothed. "You're safe." She clutched at his arm, the dream still vivid in her mind. "Blackstone, he's not here," Quentin assured her, "and he won't find us. It's time to go." Outside, the town had settled into the quiet of late night. Only the saloon at the far end of the street showed signs of life, tinny piano music and raucous laughter floating on the still air. Mrs. Holloway had left the back door unlocked as promised, allowing them to slip out unseen. Palomino waited in the small stable behind the boarding house, already saddled and laden with their supplies. Quentin helped Katherine mount, then swung up behind her with practiced ease. "We'll skirt the town to the east," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "The trail begins about 2 miles out, near the old lightning-struck pine." They moved slowly through the darkness, Quentin guiding the horse with minimal pressure, avoiding twigs or stones that might create noise. Katherine found herself holding her breath whenever they passed close to another building, expecting at any moment to hear a shout of discovery. But luck was with them. They reached the edge of town without incident and increased their pace once they hit open country. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful, romantic even. As it was, Katherine found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. "There," Quentin said after they'd ridden for nearly an hour. He pointed to a massive pine, its top sheared off by some long-ago lightning strike. "The trail should be just beyond." They found it easily enough, a narrow path winding up into the foothills, barely visible in the starlight. It didn't look like much, certainly nothing that would lead all the way to Tucson, but Katherine trusted Quentin's judgment. The trail climbed steadily, forcing them to travel at an even slower pace. Palomino picked his way carefully over rocky ground, his ears flicking back and forth as he navigated the unfamiliar terrain. Katherine leaned back against Quentin's chest, drawing strength from his solid presence behind her. "We'll stop at dawn," he promised as he felt her fatigue. "Find somewhere defensible to rest during the day." Katherine nodded, too tired to speak. The medication had worn off and her ankle throbbed in time with her heartbeat. But still she endured, knowing that each mile put distance between them and Blackstone's men. Dawn found them high in the mountains, the trail having wound its way up through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. Quentin found a small clearing beside a spring, an ideal spot to rest, with water for both them and the horse, and good visibility in all directions. As he helped Katherine dismount, she stumbled, her good leg cramping from hours in the saddle. Quentin caught her against his chest, his arms wrapping securely around her waist. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you." For a moment they stood pressed together, neither making any move to separate. Katherine looked up into Quentin's face, lined with fatigue but still handsome in the soft morning light. On impulse, she raised herself on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. Unlike their earlier kiss in the boarding house, which had been gentle and exploratory, this one ignited instantly. Quentin's arms tightened around her as he returned the kiss with a hunger that matched her own. His hand slid up to cradle the back of her head, fingers tangling in her hair as he deepened the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Quentin rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. That was. He began. Overdue, Katherine finished for him, a smile curving her lips. He laughed softly, the sound warming her from the inside out. Very much so. He brushed another quick kiss against her mouth before reluctantly setting her down on a fallen log. But you need rest, and I need to make sure we haven't been followed. While Quentin secured the perimeter of their temporary camp, Katherine took stock of their supplies. The bundle he'd purchased in Copper Springs contained jerky, hardtack, coffee, and to her surprise a small jar of honey and a package of tea. "I remember you mentioning once that you missed having tea," Quentin explained when he returned to find her examining the items. "When you thanked me for delivering a package from your aunt last spring." The fact that he'd remembered such a small detail, something she'd mentioned in passing months ago, touched Katherine deeply. It was further evidence of how closely he'd been paying attention to her all this time, even when she'd barely noticed him. They shared a simple breakfast, then Quentin insisted Katherine take the first sleep shift while he kept watch. Too exhausted to argue, she curled up on the bedroll he'd laid out for her, using his saddle as a pillow. "Wake me in a few hours," she murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "You need rest too." "I will," he promised, though something in his tone made her suspect he had no intention of doing so. Katherine slept fitfully, her dreams a confused jumble of pursuits and escapes. She woke in the late afternoon to find Quentin still vigilant, his rifle across his knees as he scanned the trail below them. "You didn't wake me," she accused, sitting up stiffly. He turned to her with a tired smile. "You needed the sleep more than I did, and now you're exhausted." She frowned at the dark circles under his eyes. "You can't protect us if you collapse from fatigue, Quentin." He acknowledged the truth of her words with a nod. "I'll rest now. We'll move on at dusk." This time, it was Katherine who insisted on taking watch while he slept. Her ankle felt much improved after rest and another dose of the doctor's powders, and she was perfectly capable of holding a rifle and sounding an alarm if needed. Quentin surrendered with minimal argument, stretching out on the bedroll she'd just vacated. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep, the lines of worry temporarily eased from his face. Katherine watched him for a long moment, struck by how vulnerable he looked in repose, so different from the capable protector he presented while awake. The afternoon passed quietly. Katherine checked her ankle, pleased to find the swelling almost gone and no sign of returning infection. She changed the bandage using supplies from their medical kit, then tested her weight on it. There was still pain, but it was manageable. She could ride without slowing them down too much. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Katherine reluctantly woke Quentin. He came alert instantly, hand reaching for his gun before he fully registered where he was. "Easy," she soothed, echoing his words from earlier. "It's just me." He relaxed, sitting up and running a hand through his tousled hair. "Any sign of pursuit?" "None." She handed him a cup of the coffee she'd prepared. "The trail's been quiet all afternoon." They broke camp efficiently, Quentin insisting on checking Katherine's ankle himself before helping her onto Palomino. His approval of her self-treatment was evident in his smile. "You'd have made a good field medic," he commented as he mounted behind her. "I've had practice," she replied. "My father wasn't exactly careful when it came to farm accidents." The mention of her father brought a momentary pang of grief. In the rush of events, she'd barely had time to properly mourn him. For all his flaws, the drinking, the gambling that had ultimately led to her current predicament, he had loved her in his way. Sensing her melancholy, Quentin's arms tightened briefly around her waist. No words were necessary. His silent support said everything. They traveled through the night, the trail growing increasingly difficult as it wound higher into the mountains. By midnight, they'd reached an elevation where the air was noticeably thinner and cooler. Katherine was grateful for the extra blanket Quentin had purchased in Copper Springs as the temperature continued to drop. "How much further to Tucson?" she asked during a brief stop to rest the horse. "If we keep this pace, we should reach the outskirts by tomorrow evening," Quentin replied. "From there, it's a matter of getting to Sullivan without being seen." "Do you really think he can help us? That his evidence will be enough to stop Blackstone?" Quentin's expression was grim in the starlight. "I hope so. Sullivan's been building a case for years: land fraud, intimidation, suspected murder. But Blackstone has friends in high places. It won't be easy." "And if it doesn't work?" Katherine voiced the fear that had been growing in her mind. "If the law can't or won't help us?" Quentin was silent for a long moment. "Then we keep running," he said finally. "Find somewhere far enough away that Blackstone's reach can't follow. Canada, maybe, or California." The thought of running forever, always looking over their shoulders, made Katherine's heart ache. Yet the alternative, returning to Stillwater, to Blackstone, was unthinkable. "I won't let him win," she said, as much to herself as to Quentin. "Whatever it takes." "That's my girl," Quentin murmured, the simple phrase sending warmth through her despite the mountain chill. They continued their journey, the night passing in a blur of rocky trails and whispered conversations. Katherine learned more about Quentin's past: his childhood in Texas, his time with the Rangers, the circumstances that had driven him west to seek redemption. In turn, she shared stories of her mother, pieced together from her father's reminiscences, and her own dreams of someday having land of her own to farm as she saw fit. "You'd be good at it," Quentin said when she described her plans for rotating crops and water management. "You've got a natural understanding of the land." "My father always said I had dirt in my blood," Katherine laughed. He meant it as a compliment, though it didn't sound like one. Dawn was breaking as they crested a ridge and got their first distant glimpse of Tucson, a smudge on the horizon that represented safety, or so they hoped. They found shelter in a rocky overhang for the day, both too exhausted for more than the most basic conversation as they shared jerky and the last of their coffee. This time, when Quentin suggested they both rest while Palomino stood guard, the horse would snort and stamp if anyone approached. Katherine didn't argue. They laid their bedrolls side by side, and as Katherine drifted toward sleep, she felt Quentin's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt as intimate as any kiss. "Rest well," he murmured. "Tonight we end this." The sound of a twig snapping brought them both instantly awake. The sun was high. They'd slept longer than intended. Quentin was on his feet in an instant, gun drawn, while Katherine scrambled for the rifle. "Stay down," he whispered, gesturing for her to take cover behind a large boulder. Katherine moved silently into position, her heart pounding as she peered around the rock. At first, she saw nothing but empty trail and forest. Then a movement caught her eye, a flash of color among the trees below their position. A man emerged onto the trail, then another. Even from this distance, Katherine recognized the second man's distinctive had it belonged to Silas Jenkins, Blackstone's foreman and right-hand man. "How did they find us?" she whispered in disbelief. They'd been so careful, taken a trail few knew existed. "Someone in Copper Springs must have talked," Quentin replied grimly. "Or they got lucky." More men appeared, below 5 in total, all armed, all scanning the mountainside methodically. They were still a good distance away, but moving steadily upward. "We need to move," Quentin decided. Now, while they're still searching the lower trail. They packed swiftly and in silence, keeping low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. Palomino seemed to sense the urgency, standing perfectly still as they saddled him and secured their meager belongings. Instead of returning to the trail, Quentin led them up and around the ridge, following a deer path so faint Katherine would have missed it entirely if she'd been alone. The going was treacherous, loose shale that shifted underfoot, thorny brush that tore at their clothes, steep inclines that forced them to dismount and lead Palomino by hand. By mid-afternoon, they'd put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers, but the detour had cost them precious time. Tucson was still hours away, and the sun was already beginning its westward descent. "We won't reach the city before nightfall," Quentin admitted as they paused to catch their breath. "We'll have to find somewhere to hole up for the night." Catherine's heart sank. Another night in the wilderness meant another opportunity for Blackstone's men to catch up with them. But she nodded, trusting Quentin's judgment. "Could we make it to a farm or homestead instead?" she suggested. "Someone who might give us shelter." Quentin considered this. "There's a mission about 2 hours from here, San Xavier del Bac. The priests there might take us in without asking too many questions." It was a risk the mission would be the first place Blackstone's men would check if they suspected their quarry had left the mountain trail. But it also offered real shelter, perhaps even horses fresh enough to carry them the final distance to Tucson by morning. "Let's try it," Katherine decided. "I trust you." The simple declaration seemed to straighten Quentin's shoulders. He helped her back onto Palomino with renewed determination, and they set off at the fastest pace the terrain would allow. The sun was setting when they first glimpsed the white walls of the mission gleaming in the distance. San Xavier del Bac stood like a beacon on the desert plain, its twin bell towers reaching toward the darkening sky. They approached cautiously, Quentin scanning the surroundings for any sign of Blackstone's men. The mission appeared peaceful, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. A few indigenous children playing in the courtyard under the watchful eye of a black-robed priest. At the gate, they were met by a young novice who looked startled at their appearance, travel-worn, dusty, with the unmistakable wariness of people on the run. "We seek sanctuary for the night," Quentin explained, keeping his voice low. "And perhaps fresh horses in the morning. We can pay." He offered a gold coin that represented nearly half their remaining funds. The novice hesitated, then nodded. "Wait here. I will get Father Miguel." Father Miguel turned out to be a middle-aged Spaniard with keen eyes and a face weathered by years in the desert sun. He listened to their request without interruption, his gaze moving from Quentin to Katherine and back again. "You are pursued," he stated rather than asked. Quentin didn't deny it. "By men who mean us harm. We seek only shelter for the night, Father. We'll be gone at first light." The priest studied them a moment longer. "The church offers sanctuary to all who need it," he said finally. "But I must know, are you fugitives from justice?" "No, Father," Katherine spoke up. "From injustice. A man named Blackstone seeks to force me into marriage against my will to steal my land." Father Miguel's expression softened. "I understand. Come, you will be safe within these walls tonight." They were given a small room in the mission's guest quarters, simple but clean, with 2 narrow cots, a basin of water for washing, and a plate of beans and tortillas. The priest asked no more questions but assured them that the mission's indigenous guards would keep watch through the night. Alone at last, Katherine sank onto one of the cots with a sigh of relief. "Do you think we're safe here?" Quentin set his rifle within easy reach before sitting opposite her. "Safer than on the trail, but we shouldn't linger in the morning." Katherine nodded, picking at the food without much appetite. Now that they had a moment of relative security, the enormity of what lay ahead pressed down on her. Even if they reached Tucson, even if Sullivan's evidence was strong enough to interest the authorities, Blackstone would not give up easily. Men like him rarely did. "What are you thinking?" Quentin asked softly, noticing her distraction. Katherine looked up, meeting his concerned gaze. "That I'm tired of running, that I want this to be over one way or another." He reached across the space between them to take her hand. "It will be, I promise you." "You can't promise that," she said, though she didn't pull away. "Blackstone is powerful, connected." "Even if we reach Sullivan, then we'll face whatever comes together," Quentin interrupted. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, the gentle touch at odds with the steel in his voice. "I didn't bring you this far to lose you now, Katherine." The raw emotion in his words made her throat tighten. "Why?" she whispered. Why risk everything for me? Quentin's eyes never left hers. Because from the moment I first saw you, I knew you were worth fighting for. Because every time I delivered a letter to your farm, every time you smiled or spoke a kind word, I felt more alive than I had in years. His voice dropped lower. Because I think I've been falling in love with you since that very first day, and I'm not about to let Blackstone or anyone else take you away. The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Katherine felt tears welling in her eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so unexpected, so profound, it left her breathless. "Quentin," she said, her voice scarcely above a whisper, "I think I'm falling in love with you too." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He moved to sit beside her on the narrow cot, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Then we have something worth fighting for, don't we?" This time when they kissed, it was with the certainty of feelings declared, with hope for a future they would carve out together. Katherine wrapped her arms around his neck, drawing him closer, pouring all her fear, gratitude, and newfound love into the embrace. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he promised, "I'm going to court you properly. Take you for rides that don't involve running for our lives. Bring you flowers instead of bandages. Ask your permission to call on you like a gentleman should." Katherine laughed softly, her hands still resting on his shoulders. "I'd like that, though I have to say most courtships probably aren't this exciting." His answering laugh was warm and genuine. "No, I suppose not." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression growing serious again. "Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." They slept in their clothes, ready to move at a moment's notice. Despite her exhaustion, Katherine found sleep elusive, her mind racing with thoughts of what awaited them in Tucson. She watched Quentin in the dim light filtering through the small window, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hand remained close to his gun even in sleep. He'd risked everything for her, this man who'd quietly loved her from afar for months. Whatever happened tomorrow, she was grateful for the unexpected gift of finding him amid the chaos. Dawn came too soon, gray light seeping into their small room as a bell called the mission's inhabitants to morning prayer. They rose quickly, gathering their few belongings. Father Miguel met them in the courtyard, offering a simple breakfast and the news that no strangers had approached the mission during the night. "I have arranged for fresh horses," the priest told them, "and a guide who knows the quickest way to Tucson." The guide turned out to be a young Tohono O'odham man named Lewis, who greeted them with a silent nod. His face was impassive, but his eyes missed nothing as he assessed their condition and the urgency of their situation. "He will take you through the wash," Father Miguel explained. "It is faster than the main road and less watched." They thanked the priest for his kindness, Quentin pressing another gold coin into his hand despite his protests. "For the mission," Quentin insisted, "and for those who might come after us needing help." The horses provided by the mission were sturdy Mustangs, not as tall as Palomino but well suited to the desert terrain. Lewis led them at a brisk pace, following dry creek beds and narrow game trails that wound their way toward Tucson. He spoke little, but his vigilance never wavered as he scanned the landscape for signs of pursuit. By mid-morning, the sprawl of Tucson came into view, a dusty collection of adobe buildings, wooden structures, and canvas tents that constituted the territorial capital. Katherine felt a surge of hope at the sight. Somewhere in that town was James Sullivan, the man who might hold the key to their freedom. Lewis guided them to the southern edge of town, then pointed toward a nondescript building a few streets in. "Courthouse," he said, one of the few words he'd spoken all morning. "Good luck." With that, he turned his horse and melted back into the desert landscape as silently as he'd appeared. Quentin led them through back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Blackstone's men might be watching. They left their horses at a small livery stable, Quentin paying extra for the stableman's discretion. then continued on foot to the territorial courthouse. The building was larger than Katherine had expected, an imposing structure of red brick that stood out among the simpler adobe construction around it. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with the scent of dust and paper. A bored-looking clerk directed them to a small office at the back when Quentin asked for James Sullivan. Sullivan himself was a surprise younger than Katherine had imagined, perhaps 30, with spectacles perched on a narrow nose and ink-stained fingers that spoke of long hours with documents. His eyes widened when Quentin stepped into his office. "Pierce, is that really you?" He rose, grasping Quentin's hand in a firm shake. When I didn't hear back, I thought. His gaze shifted to Katherine, curiosity evident. "And you must be Miss Atwood. You know who I am." Katherine asked, startled. Sullivan gestured for them to sit. "Quentin wrote to me about your situation weeks ago. I've been expecting you." He frowned. "Though not in quite this condition, you look like you've been through hell." "Close enough," Quentin replied grimly. "Blackstone's men have been on our trail since we left Stillwater. They nearly caught us in the mountains yesterday." Sullivan's expression sobered. "Then we need to move quickly. I've compiled evidence of Blackstone's activities over the past 5 years: land fraud, intimidation, suspected involvement in at least 3 deaths, though nothing that would stand up in court on its own." He pulled a thick file from his desk drawer. "With Miss Atwood's testimony about his attempt to force her into marriage, we might have enough to convince Judge Holbrook to issue an arrest warrant." "Might," Katherine repeated, her heart sinking. "Blackstone has friends in the territorial government," Sullivan admitted. "And money talks in Tucson, just like everywhere else." "When can we see the judge?" Quentin asked. "He's hearing cases now. I could try to get you in during the lunch recess." Sullivan glanced at the clock on the wall. "That gives us about an hour to prepare." The next 60 minutes were a whirlwind of activity. Sullivan helped Katherine craft a formal statement about Blackstone's threats and coercion, while Quentin added details about the pursuit that had followed their escape. By the time they approached Judge Holbrook's chambers, Katherine felt as prepared as she could be, though her heart pounded with nervousness. Judge Holbrook turned out to be a portly man with bushy side whiskers and shrewd eyes that assessed them carefully as Sullivan made the introductions. He listened to their story without interruption, occasionally making notes on the pad before him. "This is a serious allegation against a prominent citizen," he said when they'd finished. "Mr. Blackstone has many business interests in the territory, contributes generously to various causes." "He's also a murderer and a thief," Quentin said bluntly, "and he's hunting Miss Atwood as we speak." The judge frowned at his tone but continued to flip through Sullivan's file. "There is circumstantial evidence here that warrants investigation," he conceded, "but an arrest warrant. That's a significant step." "He threatened to force me into marriage against my will," Katherine spoke up, her voice stronger than she felt. "He's pursuing us across the territory with armed men. How much more evidence do you need of his criminal intent, Your Honor?" The judge studied her for a long moment. "You understand that making false statements to this court is itself a crime." "Every word I've spoken is the truth," Katherine replied steadily, "as God is my witness." Something in her demeanor must have convinced him, for he nodded slowly and reached for an official-looking document. "I'll issue a warrant for Victor Blackstone's arrest on charges of attempted coercion and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Marshal Cooper can serve it immediately." Relief washed over Katherine so strongly she felt lightheaded. Quentin's hand found hers, squeezing gently in silent support. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sullivan said, gathering up his files. "We'll head directly to the marshal's office." But as they turned to leave, the judge's next words stopped them cold. "I should warn you, Mr. Sullivan. Blackstone arrived in Tucson this morning. I saw him entering the Grand Hotel myself." Katherine's blood froze in her veins. Blackstone was here in Tucson, not just his men. He'd come personally to ensure she didn't escape. "We need to move now," Quentin said urgently, ushering Katherine toward the door. "Before he learns we're here." They hurried from the courthouse, Sullivan leading them through back streets toward the marshal's office. Katherine could feel her hard-won composure cracking with each step. Blackstone was here. He'd followed them all this way, his determination to possess her and her land apparently limitless. Almost there, Sullivan encouraged as they turned a corner. The marshal's office is just ahead. But as they approached the building marked with the territorial marshal's star, a familiar figure emerged from a cross street, flanked by two armed men. Victor Blackstone stood directly in their path, his cold eyes fixing on Katherine with a look of triumph that made her blood run cold. "Well, well," he drawled, his hand resting casually on his gun. "What a pleasant surprise. I've been looking everywhere for you, my dear." Quentin moved instantly, positioning himself between Katherine and Blackstone. "We have a warrant for your arrest," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Signed by Judge Holbrook himself. Step aside." Blackstone laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "A piece of paper won't save you, boy, or her." His gaze shifted to Katherine. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Miss Atwood, more than you're worth, some might say." "Then let me go," Katherine replied, proud that her voice didn't tremble. "If I'm not worth the trouble." "Oh, but your land is." Blackstone's smile was cold. "Especially with the railroad coming through. Did you know your worthless father was sitting on a fortune and never realized it? All that copper just waiting to be mined." Copper? Katherine's mind raced. Her father had never mentioned minerals on their property. "The survey team found it last year," Blackstone continued, clearly enjoying her surprise. "Right under that useless north pasture where you grow that pitiful corn crop, worth thousands, millions even. And all I had to do was get your father drunk enough to bet his deed at cards." "You cheated him," Quentin accused. Blackstone shrugged. "Business is business." "Unfortunately, he died before signing over the property officially, but a husband has legal right to his wife's holdings." His hand moved to his gun. "Now, we can do this the easy way, or you can drop your weapon and raise your hands," a new voice interrupted. Marshal Cooper stepped from the doorway of his office, shotgun leveled at Blackstone's chest. "I heard every word of that confession, Blackstone. Fraud, coercion, intent to commit forced marriage, that's more than enough to hold you while we investigate those other matters Judge Holbrook mentioned." Blackstone's face contorted with rage. For a terrible moment, Katherine thought he might draw despite the marshal's shotgun. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands. "This isn't over," he snarled, his gaze burning into Katherine, "not by a long shot." As the marshal's deputies disarmed Blackstone and his men, Quentin turned to Katherine, his eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" she nodded, though her legs felt suddenly weak with reaction. "It's really over." "It is," he confirmed, his arms slipping around her waist to support her. "He'll stand trial for what he's done. And even if he somehow avoids prison, he won't be able to threaten you again." Katherine let herself lean against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. After days of running, of fear, of uncertainty, the sudden resolution left her feeling hollow, drained of emotion. Sullivan approached, a relieved smile on his face. "Marshal Cooper will want statements from both of you, but it can wait until tomorrow. You need rest." He held out a key. "My sister runs a boarding house near the courthouse. I've arranged rooms for you both." The boarding house turned out to be a comfortable two-story adobe building with a central courtyard shaded by a massive cottonwood tree. Sullivan's sister, Martha, was a practical woman who took one look at their exhausted state and insisted on hot baths and a proper meal before any further discussion. Later, refreshed and wearing clean clothes borrowed from Martha's wardrobe, Katherine sat with Quentin in the courtyard as twilight descended. The events of the day seemed almost dreamlike now, the confrontation with Blackstone already taking on the quality of a nightmare receding in the light of day. "What will you do now?" Quentin asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Katherine considered the question. For so long, her only goal had been escape, survival. The future beyond that had been a luxury she couldn't afford to contemplate. "Go home, I suppose," she said finally. Try to make something of the farm again. She hesitated, glancing at him. What about you? Quentin looked down at his hands, then back up to meet her gaze. That depends entirely on you, her heart quickened. On me. I meant what I said at the mission, he said, his voice low and intense. I love you, Katherine, have for months now. But I won't presume to make decisions for you, not after what you've been through with Blackstone. Katherine reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. I meant what I said too. These past few days have been terrifying, exhausting, and the most alive I've ever felt, because of you. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. That's not exactly a conventional foundation for a relationship. Since when have either of us been conventional? She leaned closer. I want to go home to Stillwater, yes, but I want you to come with me. The hope that blazed in his eyes made her heart skip. As what? As whatever you want to be, she replied softly. My friend, my partner. She hesitated, then added, my husband eventually, if that's what you want too. Quentin's free hand came up to cup her cheek. I want that more than anything, but we don't have to rush. I meant it about courting you properly. Katherine smiled, covering his hand with her own. I think we're well past the need for formal courtship, don't you? After everything we've been through, his answering laugh warmed her from within. Maybe so, but you deserve roses and dances and all the things young women dream of. I dreamed of freedom, Katherine said simply, and someone who would see me for myself, not as property to be claimed or a prize to be won. You gave me both those things. She leaned forward, her lips brushing his in a soft kiss. The rest is just details. They stayed in Tucson for a week, giving their testimonies to Marshal Cooper and seeing Blackstone formally charged with multiple crimes. The evidence Sullivan had gathered, combined with their statements and the marshal's own witness of Blackstone's confession, was damning. Even with his connections, it seemed unlikely he would escape prison this time. Word came from Stillwater that Blackstone's men had abandoned his ranch upon hearing of his arrest. The town was cautiously optimistic about the future, especially once news spread about the copper deposits that might soon be legally mined, bringing prosperity to the entire region. On their final night in Tucson, Quentin surprised Katherine with a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band set with a single small diamond. It's not much, he apologized, but I wanted you to have something tangible, a promise of what's to come. Katherine's eyes filled with tears as she slipped the ring onto her finger. It's perfect, she whispered, knowing she meant not just the ring, but everything this man, their shared journey, the future stretching out before them. They were married the next morning in a simple ceremony at Tucson's small church, with Sullivan and his sister as witnesses. The bride wore a blue dress borrowed from Martha, her hair adorned with desert wildflowers. The groom looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in all creation. Their journey back to Stillwater was markedly different from their flight from it, leisurely, filled with conversation and laughter and stolen kisses when they camped under the stars. When they finally crested the rise that overlooked the town, Katherine felt a surge of emotion at the sight of her farmhouse in the distance. Home, she murmured, more to herself than to Quentin. He reached forward to squeeze her hand. Our home now, he corrected gently, if you'll have me. Katherine turned in the saddle to face him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Always, she promised, for as long as we both shall live. And as they rode down toward the waiting farmhouse, toward the land that had nearly cost them everything but would now help build their future, Katherine knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, the mail carrier who'd loved her from afar and the farmer's daughter who'd found her strength in the midst of danger. They had been forged in fire, tested by adversity, and emerged stronger for it. Their story, which had begun in fear and desperation, would continue in love and hope, a new chapter waiting to be written with each sunrise. Stillwater, Arizona territory, would never be the same. And neither would they. 10 years later, the property that had once been Henry Atwood's struggling farm had transformed into one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. The copper mine on the North Ridge employed dozens of local men, while the southern pastures supported a growing herd of cattle. The farmhouse itself had been expanded, a wide veranda now wrapping around three sides to catch the evening breeze. On that veranda, Katherine Pierce sat in a rocking chair, watching her two children playing in the yard below. 8-year-old Sarah chased her 5-year-old brother Henry in an endless game of tag, their laughter carrying on the warm summer air, careful by the garden. Katherine called as the children veered dangerously close to her prized vegetable patch. A hand settled on her shoulder, and she looked up to see her husband standing behind her, his smile as warm as it had been on their wedding day. "Let them play," Quentin said, dropping a kiss on her forehead. "You've been working those tomato plants to death anyway," Katherine swatted at him playfully. "Those tomatoes will feed us all winter, I'll have you know." "We could buy tomatoes with all that copper money," he teased, settling into the chair beside hers. "Wagon loads of them. It's not the same." Katherine reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in the familiar gesture that had become second nature over the years. "How was town?" "Bustling. The railroad station is nearly complete." He squeezed her hand. Sullivan sent a telegram. Blackstone's final appeal was denied. "He'll serve his full 20 years. Katherine nodded, her expression solemn. Even after a decade, the mention of Victor Blackstone's name could still send a chill through her. He had nearly destroyed everything she held dear, had hunted her across the territory with murderous intent. But he had also, inadvertently, led her to Quentin, to the life she now cherished beyond measure. "Good," she said simply. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Katherine thought about the journey that had brought them here, the desperate flight from Stillwater, the pain and fear, the moment when Quentin had stood between her and Blackstone, ready to die to protect her. "What are you thinking about?" Quentin asked, noticing her introspection. Katherine turned to him with a smile. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best ones. If my father hadn't gotten into debt with Blackstone, if you hadn't delivered that mail and noticed me." She shrugged. "Who knows where we'd both be now?" "I'd have found you somehow," Quentin said with certainty. "Even if it took longer, even if the circumstances were different, some things are just meant to be." As if to emphasize his point, little Henry broke away from his sister's pursuit and ran to the porch, flinging himself into Katherine's lap. "Mama, Sarah's trying to tag me and I'm tired of running," Katherine laughed, wrapping her arms around her son. "Then I suppose you're caught, aren't you?" Sarah bounded up the steps, her dark hair so like her father's escaping from its braids. "That's not fair. He's hiding." "Strategic retreat," Quentin corrected with mock seriousness. "A valuable skill." Sarah rolled her eyes in a perfect imitation of her mother. "Can we have pie now?" "You promised pie after chores." "And are your chores all done?" Katherine raised an eyebrow. Both children nodded vigorously, though Katherine suspected the henhouse might not have been swept as thoroughly as she'd instructed. Still, it was too beautiful an evening to quibble over minor details. "All right then, pie it is." She set Henry on his feet and rose, smoothing her skirts. "Sarah, you can help me serve." As the children raced inside, Quentin caught Katherine's hand, pulling her back for a moment. "I love you," he said simply, the words no less powerful for having been spoken thousands of times over the years. Katherine's heart swelled with the familiar rush of emotion. "And I love you," she replied, leaning down to kiss him softly. Together they went inside, to the home they had built, to the family they had created, to the life they had fought for and won against all odds. Outside, the sun set on Stillwater, Arizona territory, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Another day ended, another would begin. And the love story that had started with a desperate escape from a forced marriage would continue, growing deeper and richer with each passing year. She had been forced to wed a killer. The cowboy had faced him and taken her home. And in doing so, had given her everything she had ever truly wanted.